Hey class, today we are going to look at the beauty myth and representations of the body. So I'm going to start giving you some further information about the theoretical grounding of the beauty myth and how it's going to connect to many of the videos as well as the analysis that Possehl gives of Butler's theory of performativity of gender and Export's performance art work. So her feminist performance art. So the beauty myth and the idea of representations of the body and how they are controlled through dominant norms and systems of objectification that end up inevitably leading to violence are really important to our unit considerations here. So I want you to be able to connect the beauty myth to objectification to violence. And some of the prompts for this week for your paper will ask you to further explore that in your own words and through using examples either from the course materials or that would fit with the course materials within our contemporary world. All right, so first, let's start with the beauty myth. So the beauty myth represents a series of expectations for femininity, for feminine identified people, for femme peoples that function inevitably to constrain or control or limit the options and resources that feminine identified peoples, femme peoples, women have access to. So some of the ways in which this occurs is through the kinds of controlling images of femininity that dominate within our world. But other things that connect to this are the ways in which we associate femininity with body object or with the being of an object rather than the being of a subject. We oftentimes think that women's value, feminine identified people's value, femme people's value lies in their body as a resource, whether that is in terms of resource as a beautiful aesthetic object or resource as a reproductive object. These are connected. And by contrast, within a patriarchal world, men and masculine identified persons are taught, and there are images that support this, as well as laws and norms and access to resources, access to being seen as a leader, as powerful, etc., that function to reinforce the subjectivity of man. So we end up inevitably living in a world where women are reduced to body objects, men are elevated as subjects. You should hear remnants, or you should hear hearkening back to Mulvey's point in one of our earlier readings this semester as well. She looked at the way in which film functions to do this. Today we're looking at it in more of a theoretical component by looking at the beauty myth, but then we'll look at it in performance art as well. But the beauty myth functions to create a context in which women are reduced to objects to be looked at, men are elevated as the subjects who have the power of vision to see and define and construct the value of those that are identified as objects. And then the effect on women, on feminine identified peoples, on femme peoples, etc., is that they learn that their value is retained through or exists through their bodies as well. So we refer to this as the internalization of oppression. So even if you don't participate in the kinds of activities or behaviors that are encouraged through the deployment of the beauty myth, you oftentimes learn that your value lies within your body or in reference to your body rather than in your mind, or through intellectual pursuits or through your contributions to your community that are entrepreneurial, that are social, that are political, etc. Rather, you learn that your body is the source of your value, and that dignity is not something that you are owed as a human being, as a subject, but rather you learn that you're your body. You can learn to participate in objectification of self as well. So I learned to see myself as an object that I can fix through the procurement of products that are sold to me to fix my body, or in relationships. If we think about romantic or intimate relationships, if I have internalized that my value lies in making myself a perfect object, then I may seek to make myself a perfect object for the other, because this is how I've learned to see myself. This is the lens through which I understand my own identity or my own selfhood. So the beauty myth enables us in this way that is very relevant and maybe apparent within our contemporary world. It enables us to see the way in which objectification of women occur within dominant society. Later this semester, we'll blow this up. We'll think about the objectification of people of color. You can begin doing this right now. One of the videos for the week by Stacey Adams, it's a performance art piece through the mode of dance, interpretive dance. Maya Angelou's poem plays in the background, and the point of this video is to show through the words that interface with the dance that Adams performs, to show the way in which Black women are specifically objectified and reduced, and to show that despite all this, still they rise. So Adams' dance represents the subjectivity that Black women have always had, and Maya Angelou's words force us to consider the ways in which systems of oppression that intersect, so think back to intersectionality from last unit, systems of oppression intersect in order to teach both Black women and society writ large that Black women shouldn't seek subjectivity. So Adams is subverting those messages. Other connections throughout the unit, when you watch Ono's cut piece, you want to think about the way in which she's subverting this notion of consent. So there is a reference to rape culture and to gender-based violence throughout this unit as well. You want to think about the ways in which dominant society teaches us that women, femme peoples, feminine identified peoples, gender marginalized people generally, are objects. They are their bodies, and thus they shouldn't seek to have subjective power, subjective right, political power. Rather, they should submit to being controlled by others, and the effect this has on the possibility for people with power to recognize the limits of consent as it is given. So watch what Ono gives consent to. Think about the framework of the performance art piece, cut piece itself. What does she want the audience members to do? What does she ask them to do to participate in this performance art piece with her? And what inevitably happens? And how does this reference notions of violence and consent as they play out in our contemporary world as well? There's a connection here to Export's performance artwork as well that Postle will unpack for you in her analysis of the connections between Judith Butler's work and Valley Export's performance art. So Judith Butler is a theorist, she's a philosopher, and her theory of gender as performative is very influential in women's and gender studies, but there is feminist performance art that functions to help show us the worth as well as sort of the heart of Butler's theory in maybe more approachable terms. So Export, like Ono, is going to show through creating tension and through showing the absurdity of the reduction of women to the status of objects, the idea of women as objects. So the idea in Ono's piece and Export's piece is that women have never really been objects. It's a social and political patriarchal world that constructs women as objects, and Ono's work problematizes that, and so does Export's work. So Export's work also references the Mulvey piece we read earlier in this semester as well. She is literally embodying a cinema as she places a cinema over her breasts in one of her performance art pieces, and invites people to touch her in the street. The idea is that voyeurism of the gaze quite literally promises access to women's bodies. And so how is the gaze itself, how is the male gaze that we covered in Unit 1 actually a form of violence through encouraging violence? This is also going to become applicable when we move to look at sexual orientation and gender identity and trans identity in the next unit. So keep this in mind.